Good afternoon, everyone. Oh, thank you. My name is Mike Amerlon, and I'm a program manager on the SharePoint Foundation team. For those of you that don't know, SharePoint Foundation is the new name for what was formerly known as Windows SharePoint Services. And on the SharePoint Foundation team, I work on the developer platform, so elements like the programmability and how you get features onto SharePoint, and some of the new things that you'll see today through this talk. So this talk is actually going to be a whirlwind tour of what's new in SharePoint programmability for developers coming into 2010. I'm going to cover the basics of SharePoint Foundation in terms of new things that we've added, new tools that you can use in your solutions as you go off and code against SharePoint. Now, there's, of course, a lot of other things in Microsoft SharePoint Server, which is the new name for MOS 2007, new things that build on top of that core foundational element of SharePoint that you can take advantage of as well. But before I really get into what's new about SharePoint, I want to take a little bit of a trip back through what was possible with SharePoint 2007. So a lot of times when people go develop against SharePoint, they're looking to customize instances of SharePoint that they've deployed to their internal intranet or for various applications. And so a lot of times it starts with, well, I've got a team site, but boy, it really doesn't work the way our team works. I want to get some information from my corporate data stores into that team site. So I'll go build a couple web parts maybe that will host on that site. And that's what people would typically do. Now, of course, with Microsoft SharePoint Server, there's portal functionality and functionality for integrating data sources. And so people would build corporate intranet portals that pull together bits and pieces of data all into one place, and you have a corporate portal. And then, of course, there was the workloads of SharePoint. I'm sure maybe some of you are familiar with the SharePoint pie chart of all the different things that SharePoint Server, when you get all the bells and whistles, what it can do. Things like enterprise content management, doing document repositories, doing workflows, doing web content management, doing BI and dashboarding. People would take those components and build specialized solutions for those. Now, with SharePoint 2010, the hope is that you look at SharePoint as a tool for building applications in the raw, if you will. So rather than just being about customizing SharePoint to make it work the way you want it to work, the idea would be that as a developer, when you want to build an application for your team or for maybe 100 people or something like that, you'll look at SharePoint 2010 and say, hey, look, there's some cool raw materials inside of SharePoint 2010 that I, as a developer, can take advantage of to go build a solution. So using SharePoint essentially as tools in your toolbox to get things done much more quickly. Things like permissions, the fact that users are already managed for you, the underlying list infrastructure, the site model, taking those bits and pieces and factoring them into your application. We really hope that SharePoint 2010 will be attractive for you in that regard. And if it's not, then just let me know about that, and you can see what your reaction is to this presentation. OK, so for making SharePoint attractive to developers, we invested in 3 areas. First among these was developer productivity. So in other words, how do developers create SharePoint solutions quickly? And really, job number 1 for that is to have great tools. When people started with SharePoint 2007, there's a lot of power in that, and there is a lot of power in that. But to get started with developing against SharePoint, a lot of times you need to go create a custom feature, some custom XML. You maybe need to build a solution cab file, so you're using this makecab.exe tool. And it's a really tough hill to climb when you're first coming into SharePoint. Once you climb it, you can do a lot of cool things. But it's a little bit difficult to get started with. And so the idea is that step 1 for making SharePoint a great platform for developers is to build some great tools. And with Visual Studio 2010 and with SharePoint Designer, they're now there. But SharePoint as a platform has also been extended to give more building blocks for developers as well. So making the list infrastructure more powerful and more flexible so that you can build applications that go against document libraries or SharePoint lists. And if you want even more power, you can build in external data sources, things like SQL Server or web services, and just integrate them into SharePoint quickly and easily in a deep way so that you get the power of SharePoint with respect to a place to host data, a user interface, forms, and views connected to the backend server that you can code any way you want to. And then on top of that, all this code is great, and it's good to be able to create solutions. But if you can't actually deploy it to the farms where your workers are at, then it's all for naught. And a lot of times what we see is that people have these very big installations of SharePoint with lots of users, lots of applications, lots of sites. And they're not going to just let you go deploy some custom assemblies to all the web front ends in that farm, because that could potentially jeopardize the stability of the entire farm. And so for that reason, a lot of times it was very hard to deploy to SharePoint Server. So with flexible deployment, what we've done is added a whole code sandbox so that you can actually deploy solutions to SharePoint site collections. They'll run in a sandbox so that IT can feel pretty comfortable about the fact that your code will only impact that site collection and won't jeopardize the experience of running in that entire farm. So it allows you to code against more SharePoint sites and makes IT more comfortable with the kinds of things that you're doing. So let's talk a little bit about developer productivity. First and foremost, the tools that you can use to build against SharePoint. So first among these is SharePoint Designer 2010, which received an entire facelift in the 2010 timeframe. It moved from being just about pages and workflows to being a whole application editor for your SharePoint site. So I know a lot of you maybe have played with SharePoint Designer 2007. Maybe you have different reactions to how it works, but in SharePoint Designer 2010, it's really a new application with a lot more capabilities, a lot more ability to get simple solutions done quickly, all from within the SharePoint Designer shell. So to do that, there's support for new types of things inside of your SharePoint sites in SharePoint Designer. Things like BDC entities, these connection definitions to backend data sources. Things like being able to work with list schema and extend them with custom actions so that you can add a list and then add some buttons into the ribbon to customize what users can do with that list. And then extending workflows so that you can build specific types of approval workflows or reusable workflows all inside of SharePoint Designer. So all in all, it's really a new application, and take a look at it, play with it. It's a free application that we'll be making available, so it's easy for users, whether they're professional developers, whether they're maybe they don't consider themselves developers, they can get started and really customize SharePoint. But sometimes you just need to supplement your site with something a little bit more substantive. You need to add some code to it to really get the experience that you want. And so as I mentioned, Visual Studio 2010 has out-of-the-box support for tools. So this is an ability to go and do things like create web parts using a visual designer, create custom entities that connect to external data sources, build workflows using code and actions in your activities to really build a full solution. On top of that, it will automatically do things like create features for you and create solution packages. So if you don't want to worry about that, you just hit F5 and it's all done for you. But if you do want to really control how your features are deployed and how your solution packages get built, there's editors so that you can customize all the properties around how your features are doing and what your solution package is set up to do. Because it's built into Visual Studio 2010, it also natively supports a lot of the facilities that Visual Studio has, such as integration into source control and application lifecycle management. And then on top of this, you can more flexibly go from the things that you create in the browser or in SharePoint Designer, and you can actually import them into Visual Studio. So there's more of a bridge for taking what you've built on the site, integrating that into SharePoint, into Visual Studio, and then further customizing it, and then packaging that out and shipping that out as a solution. So that's a very brief overview of Visual Studio 2010 and SharePoint Designer. Now I just want to show you what that looks like. But before I do that, I just want to show you SharePoint itself very briefly. This is just SharePoint Foundation, and this is just a starter site associated with SharePoint Foundation. In a very quick nutshell, there's been a number of improvements to SharePoint. First among these is the concept of a ribbon. So this is integrating a lot of the user interface elements for SharePoint into one central place so that it's ready and available for users. Another big emphasis of SharePoint is to make it easier for users to get started and start editing their site quickly. So I can just edit this page, it'll put it into edit mode, and I can do things like just get rid of this picture. Oops, let me edit that. Get rid of this picture, and then I can add some content. This is some extra content. Hello, PDC. And I can even do things like insert web parts directly into the content of my page. So if I go to the insert dialog, I can say insert web part, and I can insert the tasks list and click add. And now I can save that back to SharePoint. And so from here, I can do things like on this page, just go and add a task. Now, another emphasis of SharePoint 2010 is sort of this inline user experience so that we keep the users in context. So even if you're adding a task, it doesn't navigate you to a separate page. It'll just pop up a dialog. This is a task. Do good demos. And then I'm returned back to my site, and the task gets added to the list. So this is just basic SharePoint usability, integrating commands into the ribbon, and making it possible to richly edit it, add web parts to your site. Now, for our demos today, I want to build out a Northwind product site. Of course, Northwind, we're all familiar with that. So I've created a very simple starter site here, and I've added an announcements list that just has a very simple, lonely announcement. But we want to build out the site a little bit to house a list of products for Northwind. So to do that, I'm going to open this up in SharePoint Designer. So if I've got SharePoint Designer installed, there's a simple link on the Site Actions menu that will open up this site inside of SharePoint Designer 2010. So what you see here is the basic information about this site in terms of overall properties. And on the left-hand side, you'll see the list of all the various objects that I can edit inside the site, lists and workflows and pages and content types. Now for this demo, I just want to go ahead and get started building out my products list. So I'll just simply create a products list by clicking the custom list button. And then maybe I want to add another list for tracking the vendors. And to track the vendors, I want to start with the contacts list as my schema. But I'll call this the vendors list, like so. So in short order, I've added a couple lists. And I can drill in on products. And when I drill in on products, what you'll see is it's got all of the information about the products list in terms of views and forms. I can add custom actions, these extensions to the ribbon if I so choose, and I can also add workflows. But here, what I'll do is just add a simple column for tracking a product code. All of our products, in addition to having a title, should have a product code that sort of uniquely identifies them. And so now I'll save this back. So when I go back to my SharePoint site, and hit refresh, you'll see I've added 2 lists here very quickly, and I can get started using the vendors list in my site. So I'll just add a quick vendor, and Mercy is from Food Co., and she's located in Yuma, Arizona. Okay, so added a couple lists, and now I can get started with working with that information quickly inside of Visual Studio. But maybe I also want to make it easy for folks to add products to the list very quickly and very straightforwardly from the home page. And so in that case, what you might want to build is a web part that can add items into the list. So to do that, I'm going to go to Visual Studio 2010 and select File, New Project. Now, out of the box, as I mentioned, there's a set of different projects that focus on SharePoint, and one of those is a visual web part, which will allow me to quickly visually design a web part and then push that into SharePoint. So here, I'll just select Visual Web Part. I'll give this a name, PDC, and click OK. And it will ask me where do I want to deploy this solution to. So now it's going to generate a project for me. It'll create some default features in a default web part that I can get started editing. Now this is a visual web part, so I can just go to design mode and I can say add a product, like so. And then I can go to the toolbox and add some controls in. So I can just add standard things like a text box, which will hold my product title, and this one will hold my product code. And then I'll just add a very simple button for submitting the product, and I'll add a label which will communicate the status of adding that product. So I can just lay out some controls and get started with that. Now I want to go and jump into the source to hook this up to SharePoint. So to do that, I will drill into the code behind for this. Oh, actually, let me go back to that. Let me double click on the submission button so I can get the event handler. And I've got some pre-canned code here that I can just copy into the web part. And this is standard SharePoint APIs. I'm going to go grab an SPWeb, which is the standard object for working with SharePoint sites. And from there, I'm going to go grab the proposals, the products list that I added as well. So fairly straightforward code, standard SharePoint. But if you're not familiar with SharePoint development, just being able to do a visual web part was something that was pretty tricky before with SharePoint 2007. And now there's sort of a native project for that in Visual Studio by default. So I'll just set a breakpoint and hit F5. And what will happen is Visual Studio will do all the work for me to create a solution package, create some features. It'll have a default .webpart file. All these things that you would have needed to do by hand are automatically done. It gets pushed up to my SharePoint site, and the features on it get activated. So by default, what will happen is Visual Studio will take me to the Add New Web Part page. But in my case, I just want to go ahead and add this straight on to the Northwind site. And I'll just go Edit Page, and I'll select Add a Web Part. And in the Custom Web Part dropdown, you'll see there's a new entry here for Visual Web Part 1, which is what we just created. And I'll select Add. So now I've added my web part to this page. It's fairly simple, fairly straightforward, but I can add products pretty quickly. So I'll just add alfalfa as a product that we're tracking, alfalfa, okay. And I'll give it a product code of alpha 101 and click button. And then my breakpoint gets fired, which if you're a SharePoint developer is huge because, hey, integrated debugging and it all just works. I can use watches and I can use all the various tools of Visual Studio to find out what's going on. But this code's pretty straightforward. And so now I can see that this product has been added to my products list. And in 3 minutes or less, I've got my very simple Visual Studio web part connecting directly to my SharePoint site inside of Visual Studio. So Thank you. So great support for Visual Studio right out of the box, but we'll see a little bit more of how it can work in various ways moving forward as well. OK, so that's just a very brief look at the tools of Visual Studio. Now, one other thing I want to point out very quickly is that this laptop that I'm demoing off of today is actually a Windows 7 laptop. So for developers, what you'll be able to do is install SharePoint 2010 on developer workstations. And if your workstation happens to be Vista SP1 or happens to be Windows 7, 64-bit, you can install SharePoint on top of those, and you don't need to go through the whole complexity of setting up Windows 2008 if you don't have that available to you. OK, cool, thank you. All right, so getting back to the slides. So those are a bit about tools, and that was really one of the most important things for developers is having great tools out of the box. But the other thing we wanted to provide was more blocks and components for people to leverage in the platform. So this is just a very brief overview of what's new inside of SharePoint, and you can see the orange and the red boxes sort of denote things that are new. Now, what you should take away from this is we've extended the user interface to take advantage of things such as Silverlight and XSLT-based views, and to do things like improve our ASP.NET Forms. And also, at a layer beneath that, at our API layer, we've extended the APIs to make working with SharePoint a lot more standard. So you can, of course, use SharePoint object model, lists and list items, and all those types of bits and pieces. But you can now use REST and LINK. And you can directly talk to SharePoint using a client object model to make it easier to get data in and out of SharePoint. Now, beneath that, we have our application model, lists and sites. And what you can maybe take away from this is that that model hasn't changed so much. There aren't so many new nouns or new concepts that you need to know to get started with SharePoint. If you're familiar with how SharePoint 2007 works, a lot of that will be carried forward into SharePoint 2010. So new ways to connect, but under the covers, the platform has been just improved and not really changed so much. So let's talk about the data foundation under the covers. So if you're familiar with SharePoint, what SharePoint basically is it's a web file system. It's got this folder structure, it's got files, and layered on top of that, there's this site model. So at various places in the hierarchy, you can have SharePoint sites, and those SharePoint sites can contain things like lists, and lists with folders underneath them called libraries for storing documents. And those are the sort of the primary ingredients that you code against when you're working with SharePoint. And there's a very simple semantic for doing queries against those lists and working against them. But in SharePoint 2010, we've taken those lists and made them a bit more powerful so that you can build more sophisticated relationships and data structures using them. In addition, we've allowed you to do lookup to multiple columns, which gives you like a join capability for lists. And also, there's a layer of validation added as well. In addition, the scalability and performance of SharePoint lists have improved. But as a developer, another thing that will be relevant to you is that we also throttle lists more actively in SharePoint 2010. So if you build a list query that will go query, let's say, 20,000 items, that's something that would cause the server to have a lot of performance issues if it's not using like an indexed query and it's not really optimized for performance. So what you can do, what administrators can do is say, I don't want to let those queries through. And as developers, this is something that you'll probably run into and you'll want to be aware of. So it's more important than ever to actually design your queries against SharePoint to do things like limit the amount of data that you're bringing back and use things like indexed columns to make it more performant. Now, lists are more powerful, but a lot of times you have data structures that are outside of SharePoint, maybe legacy databases, maybe things in SQL Server where you're taking advantage of transactional semantics to get data in and out of SharePoint, and so in and out of SQL Server. And you want to host that inside of SharePoint to take advantage of the fact that maybe you're trying to integrate data from multiple sources, or you want to use SharePoint's user interface and navigation. And so the business data catalog layer that we had in SharePoint 2007 has been moved a layer lower inside of SharePoint 2010 so that you can take advantage of it. And so you can work with databases and web services and .NET code, but from the SharePoint user experience perspective, it looks and works like a SharePoint list, and you get views and forms, quote unquote, for free. And this also extends out to SharePoint, to Office applications, so you can sync it to SharePoint Workspace, and you can actually work with this data in the Office clients as well. OK, so let's take a look at these new concepts and how they work inside of SharePoint. So first, as you'll remember, we created this products list and we created a vendors list. And maybe I want to have this relationship inside of SharePoint where every product is associated with a vendor because products come from vendors. OK, so what I'll do is I'll go to the list tab and say create a new column. And so this will give me the creation experience. And I can say, OK, I want to add a new column called vendor. And I'll make this a lookup. Then what I'll do is I'll choose the vendors list to connect this to. Now, there's a couple of new things that are interesting. First, there's required that this column contains information. Do I want to make sure that every product must have a vendor in order to be a valid product? Well, that's been moved lower into the stack. So if you want to make sure that that relationship gets enforced, you can tell SharePoint to do that. In addition, I can use what's called lookup to multiple. So I can make the core field that I'm going to look up to the company field, but I can also pull in additional fields into this list so that I can, for example, sort and filter based on the city and state and province that my vendor is located in. So it's a more powerful semantic. And then finally, I can say enforce relationship behavior. And what that means is that when my vendor gets deleted, do a cascade delete so that products that are associated with that vendor will get deleted as well. So it's basic database semantics for your SharePoint lists. And it's going to say, hey, but in order to make this performant, I'm going to have to index that column. Is that OK? And I'll say yes. OK, so now when I go to my product that I just added, Alfalfa, and I connect it to my vendor, Foodco, now what you'll see is that it pulls down the city and state that that vendor came from. So if I had 10,000 items here, I could sort and filter based on what vendor what city the vendor that the product is associated with comes from. And of course, when I do things like go to my vendor list and I delete my vendor, like so, it will take the products along with it, so it's no longer there. And if I want to, I can go back to the recycle bin and restore them, and it'll bring back that blob of data into my SharePoint site. So yeah, so it's a very simple demo, but this is a really key building block for building data structures that map to the real world, vendors and products, orders and customers, et cetera. OK, so that's a bit about how to work with some of the more advanced semantics inside of SharePoint. But maybe you want to do a little bit of validation as well. And so what I want to do is make sure that when people add a product code, they add a product code that's valid. And so to do that, I'll just go to my list settings, and I'll edit that product code list column, excuse me. And I can drill into the column validation. And so what I can do from here is just say, OK, well, make sure, using an Excel formula, I can actually say, make sure that the product code is 8 characters long, like so. And when it's over, say, product codes must be 8 chars long, like so, and click OK. So very simple and easy to add validation using the power of Excel formulas directly into your list. And again, it gets enforced low in the platform, so whether you're coming in through web services or however, you'll get an error. So when I go and add a new character, it'll say, no, it must be 8 characters long. So simple and easy for end users and developers alike to take advantage of to make their lists a lot more rich and flexible. Yeah, great. But sometimes there's still things that you want to use SQL Server for. If you want transactional semantics, you want to do multi-list operations that all happen in one transaction, you're going to have to go to SQL Server for that. If you want to do some very rich aggregations and do counts of all the customers that have a particular attribute associated with them, and you want to count those up, you're going to want to use SQL Server for that. Or maybe you've got some back-end web services or data sources that you want to integrate into SharePoint. And for that, you want to use the external list infrastructure. So to do that, I'm going to go and use SharePoint Designer. Let me just reboot it. And so I'm going to go to my Northwind site. And so on the list of things that you saw that I could edit, one of them was something called external content types. So let me go pull that up. Now, for the infrastructure for external lists, we basically have 2 components. One is external content types, which essentially defines the schema of the data store that I'm going to bring into SharePoint. And then there's the instances of that schema called an external list. And in this case, I'll just go and create a new external content type. And there's a number of options here for configuring the external content type. So, the first thing I want to do is connect this to a data source. And in my case, I've got some data that's backed in a SQL server, good old Northwind. So I'll type in the name of the database and just give it a name. And so what this will do is it'll connect to that database. Now, when you work with an external content type, it can work with a whole bunch of different types of data sources, including web services. And the way it works is you define this set of operations, which define various facets of how the backend data source works. And so to make a backend data source work in SharePoint, there's 2 types of operations you need to define. A read list operation, how to read sort of a rectangle of information from the data source, and a read item operation, which defines how to actually pull down details of that item into SharePoint for things like forms. Now, in addition to that, there are operations for doing creation and update and deletion. So if you want to have this work in a read-write way inside of SharePoint, you can do that as well. So this is going to go against my backend SQL Server. And from there, I'll be able to select a table and build some operations against it. Now, once I've created this external content type and I've submitted it up to my application store, the next step is that then I can go ahead and use that in my SharePoint sites by creating an external list that uses that external content type. But in the meantime, I'm just still need to finish off building my external content type. So in this case, I've got a customers list here. And what I want to do is just right-click that. And SharePoint Designer gives me this option to create all the operations automatically for me because it knows how to work against a database, a SQL Server database. And so I'll have it go and build all those operations automatically for me. And what it'll do is will then take me through a wizard where I can specify exactly how to bind all that information from my backend SQL Server into fields that will map into my SharePoint list. And if I wanted to, I could even map it to Office properties so that various things like city and state will, or a region could show up as a contact, let's say, in Outlook. But in this case, I just want to walk through the wizard very quickly to create the basic model. And I'm just going to rename this to customers. And then I will go click save. So this will save it up to the BDC metadata store that's inside of my SharePoint server. All of this is inside of SharePoint Foundation natively. Now my metadata store is stored at the web application level. So this is the domain of administrators, central administrators. They have to be willing to accept these different types of metadata models. And then from there, inside of my site collection, I can reuse them. So now, let me just go off back to my site. What I'll do is I'll say I want to create a new external list. So I'll go to more options. And this brings a number of different options that I can pick from. And I'll say create an external list. And then I want to give this a name. This is the customers list that I'm bringing back. Now I just want to make sure that, see if SharePoint Designer is done yet, submitting these changes up to the metadata store. And once that's done, I'll be able to pick the model that I've just created and reuse it inside of my SharePoint site. Once this is ready. OK, it's almost done. The progress bar has stopped moving, so that means it's about 2 seconds away. OK, now the metadata store, the item is ready for me to go. So now when I go back to this list picker over here in my SharePoint site, you'll see that it will give me a picker of all the metadata, external content types that have been registered in the metadata store. And we have the one that we just created here, like so. And I can click create. And so what this will do is essentially build a list in my site that's powered by external data, but it looks like a SharePoint list. I can edit it, I can customize it, et cetera. Yeah?
This feature use ADF for make this?
I'm sorry, does this?
This feature use ADF for make this?
ADF?
Obligation, definition, file?
Well, it's got its own. So these metadata entries are built by a custom XML schema that's, unfortunately, it's specific to SharePoint. It doesn't use things like the entity framework, which would be better and we're looking to use in the future. It uses its own custom XML in the short term. But now that I've added this into my list, you see it's the standard Northwind data. It looks just like a SharePoint list, and I can even edit it and customize it. So I can pull up this entry for Alfred's Futterkister and click save. Clean it up a little bit. And this will go straight through from the SharePoint user interface to that backing SQL server. So that when I come back to it later, there we go. It'll be reflected back in the backend store. So very quickly, that's how you can integrate external information into SharePoint directly and get all the benefits of the SharePoint user experience for that. Thanks. And if you want more information on developing using external lists, there's a whole set of features around how you can integrate this into Office applications, how you can do more advanced types of things. You can actually build these back-end models using .NET code. So if SQL Server doesn't suit you, you can actually just write as much code to implement those operations that I mentioned. And Steve Fox will go over that on Wednesday. OK, so we've got all this data inside of SharePoint, but how can I actually code against that? And so there's a number of new data connection technologies for working with that data. Now, one of these is SP-Link. So SharePoint now exposes a link provider for getting at SharePoint data that we've appropriately called SP-Link. And this gives you two benefits. First, it gives you entity-based programming. So rather than working with list items and lists, you actually work with the data objects you're interested in, products and vendors. And once you have that sort of type-specific information, you can actually do some really cool things, like do queries that are where you benefit from all the IntelliSense of Visual Studio to make those queries quick and easy to build. So in this case, I'm doing a very simple query of give me all the orders where the customer of those orders lives in a city called London. But under the covers, what this will do is it will generate a camel-based query, camel being our XML format for doing queries in SharePoint, and it will go execute that against SharePoint. To make this all work, we've extended what you can do with this underlying query language, CAML, to support joins, so you can actually define joins on the fly using SharePoint lists. Now, SB-Link is useful if you're working on the server. If you actually have code that lives on the server, maybe part of a web part, maybe part of an event receiver, to get more rich and quick ways to program against SharePoint data. If you're working on the client, we have two technologies that you can take advantage of to work remotely against SharePoint. Now, first is a new set of client APIs. These client APIs are essentially the client version of a lot of the object model that you might have seen on the server, things like webs and list items. But now you can use them directly inside of Silverlight or JavaScript or .NET managed object model if you're building, let's say, a WinForms app. It's the same object model whether you're using JavaScript or .NET or Silverlight. And the benefit of this API is that it's built for batching and it's built for efficiency. So a lot of times, if you're, for example, calling web services, in addition to having to do all the work to unpack XML and all that type of work, it can be very chatty. In order to get the information you need, you might need to make 3 web service requests in a row. Well, with client APIs, you can actually say, here's exactly what I want, this, this, this. And in one query, it'll go and fetch that data from the server without you needing for you to go build a custom web service. And it's also got a number of advanced features around doing exception handling and conditional logic. So if you want to work with lists and list items in a very rich way, do things like check out a file in a document library, you can use the client APIs. But another feature is this support for REST-based APIs. Now, across Microsoft, you've probably heard and you've probably seen that through ADO.NET data services and the open data format, you can actually code against more types of data sources in a sort of a standard and consistent way. And this is built on top of industry standards such as Atom and JSON feeds. And then it also uses a very simple URL protocol for actually getting at the data in a SharePoint site. So the benefit of this is that SharePoint's just another player in that whole ecosystem. And tools like Visual Studio, for example, have support for working against ADO.NET-based data services, and SharePoint's one of those. But there's other tools like ASP.NET Ajax and PowerPivot, which is a new technology for doing data analysis using Excel. So let's take a look at what these various APIs look like. I'm going to start with the client object model for actually getting data into our SharePoint site remotely. And so what I've built is just a very simple mock-up application that does data migration called Remote Data. And this application is very simple. It's just a WinForms application, and it uses the client APIs. And what this will do is it'll just push some data into the products list that we've just built. So when you look at the client object model code, you'll see that there's this object called client context, which I use to say, here's the site I want to pull data from. And then I can use objects like the list object to work with that products list that we just built. Now, the client object model is different from a lot of object models because you can't just say, OK, give me the web and give me the title of that web because I want to show that somewhere. In order to actually start using the properties of the client object model, you have to ask for it first. And then have that request go over the wire. And so to ask for that data, what I have to specify is context.load. And then what it will do is I'll pass in a pointer to that web object. And what this tells the client object model to do is say, go fetch all the default properties for web because I want to read them and work with them. And in addition, I can actually use link semantics to further specify my exact query. Go get that products list and go get only the fields that have a title of description because I want to check to see if this list has been set up or run before with this provisioning code. So you can very specifically pinpoint what kind of data you want to get back from a list. And so from here, what it'll do is it'll say, if this hasn't been set up before, it will go and create a picture library on the site to store product pictures, and it will go add some additional fields to the products list. And once those products lists are all set up, it will go add a number of list items to the list. And so in this case, you can see it's doing a little bit of mocked up generation of product IDs, but here what you can see is it'll create a number of list items, and it'll use a list item object that should be pretty consistent if you've ever worked with the SP list item object on the server. But we're doing this all inside of a WinForms client. So that's a brief nutshell of how the client object model works. And when I go back to my SharePoint list and go back to the products list that we've been working on, you'll see that it's now populated with a number of entries that came from that remote Windows Forms application pushed in through the client object model. But in addition, it's done some things like it's created a product pictures library, which has a set of pictures. It uploaded some files, created that list, et cetera. So you can do some very rich things with client object model. Now, another facet that we have is REST support, and that's accessible via the listdata.svc WCF service that's available from my SharePoint site. And so when I access this, what it'll do is it'll use this open data REST-based format to actually return all the available lists inside of my site. And if I want to sort of drill into that, I can just amend the actual query to say, give me the products. And what this will do is it'll return an Atom feed of all those products that I submitted into my SharePoint site. Now, this doesn't look so interesting inside of Internet Explorer because these feeds are not necessarily designed to be directly consumed. Instead, they provide all of the metadata you need as a developer to read into that and get all of the metadata properties that are stashed for those list items. And tools like Visual Studio can build object-oriented, link-enabled wrappers that talk to these types of data feeds. And then the other cool thing about this is that you can actually specify queries on the actual URL. So if I just want to get item number 10 from this list, it'll just do a select of just that one item by itself. So you can do some very powerful things just using this combination of queries that generate Atom and JSON. Okay, so those are the remote technologies for talking to SharePoint, client APIs and REST. But if I wanted to work with it on the server, I could use Link to generate those object-oriented stubs. So to do that, I will just go into this web part project that we've been working on, and I will use a tool called SPMetal. Now, what SPMetal does is it'll generate these object-oriented link-enabled wrappers for the data that you have inside of a site. So I'll just type in the URL of my site, Northwind, and I'll say export that to a file called northwind.cs. And so this will generate objects for the products list and for all the various wrappers that I have in my site. So now when I go back to my web part project, over here, let me just make sure it stopped. OK, so now I can just incorporate that new wrapper that I built into my project. So I'll include northwind.cs. And what I also need to do is add a reference to microsoft.sharepoint.link to make this all work. So let me just scroll down. Let's see, wait for it to fill in a little bit. OK, there we go. All right, so microsoft.sharepoint.link. And so now what I want to do is I want to actually show in this web part all the beverages that have been stored on the site. So this is just a very simple demo. What I'll do is I'll just double click on the ASCX to further add that information. So I'll say beverages, like so, and add a list box. And so now when I go back to the code, I'll add a very simple link-based query. Let me go open up my canned code. So let's see. OK, now I'm going to go paste this into the onload event for this web part. So what you can see is almost similar to the way the client context works. I instantiate a Northwind data context, which I pass in the URL to my site. And from there, I can actually use a link-based query to say, give me all the products in the products list where the category is equal to beverages. You can see it's done some really cool things, like it's taken a choice field in the SharePoint site, what type of product it is, and it's converted that into an enum. So I get very good IntelliSense for working with that data. Once I've done this query, then I'll just simply add those to the list box. And to complete this sample, I just need to add some using statements for Microsoft.SharePoint.link. And I need to add another reference for system.link. And finally, I need to add a reference for system.collections.generic. So there, I've essentially extended my web part to do a link-based query to that products list that we've been building out. And it'll put those into a list box for me. So again, I'll go to my Northwind site. And what you should see when we get to our Northwind site is that now the list box should be populated only with beverages. So yeah, so you see here the list box. I've got a number of different ales and coffees and lagers. So a very simple link-based query to get the data into my site using Link. So hopefully, what this means is as a developer, SharePoint will feel a lot more like all the other developer technologies you have. You can use Link and REST and use all the existing tools that work with it. OK. And for more information on these technologies, I'm doing a session on Thursday at 10 a.m. to drill into Client OM. There's a lot more powerful semantics, how you do those queries, how you can really leverage Client OM in both JavaScript and Silverlight and .NET to really get the most out of it. And Maxim Lukyanov is doing a session on how to use WCF and the REST protocols with SharePoint as well. So if you're interested in more information on those, see us on Thursday. And look forward to seeing you there. OK, so really quickly, under the covers, we've improved a lot of the support for how you work with data on the server side as well. And one of the key technologies for doing this is events. Now in SharePoint 2007, we had item events and list events that you could code against to validate data or to do things like react to changes in the database. One of the key things we've added is after synchronous events. And so it doesn't sound very glamorous, but we had this problem inside of SharePoint where you either have a before event, which you can use to do validation against a SharePoint list, or you have this after asynchronous event, which will fire sometime after an item has actually been committed to SharePoint. But sometimes you actually want to hook something in the middle when a list item has been committed to SharePoint, but before the user actually sees a form that will show that list item. And so that's what you can do with an after synchronous event. It really gives you this very convenient point for further customizing the item update or the item manipulation pipeline in SharePoint. In addition, there's events that can be registered against the scope of an entire site collection, an SP site, if you will. There's events for web creation and list creation, so if you want to trap those events, you can do that. And you can also customize how workflow runs and how the user interface will return when your events try to cancel or validate data. You can actually redirect to error pages rather than just return a simple string. Workflow has also been improved. So in SharePoint 2007, we had item-based workflows and a set of workflow actions you could reuse and some tools inside of Visual Studio and SharePoint Designer. In 2010, there's been a lot of work on the performance and scalability of workflow to make it more possible for IT, for example, to dedicate servers to running workflow quickly and effectively. You can also register workflows at the site scope now. So a lot of times you have workflows that work against an item, let's say a document, but sometimes you want to have workflows run against a batch of documents or across all items in a SharePoint site. And so site scope workflows will allow you to do that. In Microsoft SharePoint Server 2010, along with a lot of the other extensions of client applications such as Word and Excel into the server equivalent, Visio has a way to represent a Visio diagram on the server using Silverlight-based XAML. And you can actually hook this up to your workflows so that you can actually let users see the visual progress of a workflow as a set of diagrams and boxes and arrows and that type of thing, which is something that people really are looking for when they work with workflows. They want to see what's the overall process, what's the decision points, and see what the progress of a workflow is inside of that. And finally, a lot of work has been done to make the out-of-the-box workflows a lot more reusable. If you wanted to take an approval workflow and customize it, you'd end up having to typically rebuild the approval workflow a lot of times. Well, now the workflows have been better designed as building blocks to make it easier to extend them. And finally, we have this infrastructure for service applications. So a lot of times when you have code in a web part, it does something very simple. But on other occasions, your web part might need to do like a 5-minute operation to go query some data. Or it might need to use SQL Server in a very intensive fashion to retrieve that data. And so to support that kind of architecture, you need to build up some SQL Server provisioning logic and a web service that you can talk to be an intermediary. And you want to provision that on the SharePoint farm, and it becomes pretty difficult. But it turns out that in a lot of cases, this is something that we do a lot. For example, when you have an Excel web part, it does a query to a backend server, then has a concept of a session for working on that Excel workbook. And that kind of infrastructure for having backend services that receive requests from web parts or from other capabilities is something that you can take advantage of as a developer. It's not the simplest bit of code in the world. It is a little bit complicated. But the benefit of that is that you can actually have SharePoint manage all your databases. It can provide you some load balancing logic, and it can allow you to do all that type of infrastructure managed inside of SharePoint. So this is a bit of a big iron thing, but you can take advantage of all those platform pieces that we use to build out some of the more advanced applications in SharePoint. OK, so finally, let's talk a little bit about the user interface of SharePoint. We started by showing the ribbon and how that works. And as a developer, you can take advantage of this as well. In addition, there are several other entry points, such as a status bar that you can add messages to, and there's notification areas, and there's also a dialog platform for popping up those dialogues that you as a developer can take advantage of inside of JavaScript. The SharePoint UI itself is designed to be more developer-friendly, so we're working on making our master pages well-formed, and we're working towards XHTML 1.1 strict. I'm not sure that we're going to hit that goal. We still have some custom attributes and custom tags. But the point is that the markup of SharePoint pages is a lot cleaner and a lot more standards-based. In addition, we have better browser support, so Safari and Firefox are now Tier 1 browsers, so all the rich text editing and all those features work inside of Firefox and Safari. From an accessibility perspective, we're working towards WCAG AA compliancy. And we've replaced some of our proprietary view technology with something a little bit more standards-based based on XSLT. Finally, this is maybe not so much a developer feature, but SharePoint sites can now also be multilingual. So you can have a site that says, OK, I'm available in both English and German. And if a user's preferred language is in German, then they'll see that site with a German user experience. And the UI will sort of magically switch to that language around them. As a developer, this is something you're going to want to take into account when you build your solutions. Now your web parts, previously where a website would only be in one language, now it can be exposed in multiple. And your web parts or components will need to react to that. Silverlight's another interesting development. We love Silverlight. I mean, if you think about it, Silverlight provides a great way to do visualizations and rich UI on the client. And then you've got SharePoint, which provides some great backend stuff, lists with relationships and workflows and logic and event handlers. And you take those two together, and it's a really great platform for building internet applications. So to help encourage that, we have the client object model, which I talked about, which works inside of Silverlight. We also have a Silverlight web part. So if you actually get your XAP up to a SharePoint server, you can then easily add a web part that points to that XAP, that Silverlight package, and can show them. In addition, we have some more advanced support for remotely hosting Silverlight applications and having them talk back to SharePoint. I'll go into that model a little bit on my talk on Thursday. OK, so let's take a look at what these user interface improvements look like. So I'm going to go back to my Northwind site, and I've added that customers list. Now, what I've built is essentially a feature which extends the site and allows me to add some mapping functionality. By default, SharePoint doesn't have any way to do mapping. Oh, yeah, thank you for the pointers. Switch back to my demo machine. OK, so Silverlight doesn't have a way to, SharePoint doesn't have a way to show maps. It's not really integrated with maps. But what I've built is a very simple extension that will allow me to add mapping to my blogs and forums. So I'll just turn on this particular feature. And so now when I go back to my Northwind site and I decide to add to announcement, I can say, customer map. And I can say, here are our customers, like so. And sorry, sometimes it's a little bit laggy. But when I say insert, now you'll see that there's a new button here called insert map, which is a button that I've added and extended with SharePoint. And so when I click this, you'll see a small dialog which will ask me, what do I want to hook this up to? And I'll say, hook this up to the customers list, like so. And then I can save this back to my site. And so now what you'll see is a map component. Now, what this will do is we'll use the client object model to go query SharePoint, that customers list that we just added. And then because that customer list magically has latitude and longitude, it'll actually plot those points on the Silverlight map. Now, the problem with this demo is sometimes when I first run it, it takes a little while to get warmed up. But ultimately, it should go ahead and show you those items on the map, like so. And so you can see that, OK, it turns out that most of our customers are located in the middle of Iowa, sporadically located through the middle of Iowa. But when I click on them, it'll show you the various bits and pieces of that customer, and I can skip through them. So this is just a very Silverlight component that talks back to my mapping application. But the other important thing I want to show you is that I was able to extend the ribbon, integrate with SharePoint UI pretty directly. So let's take a look at how that was done. So when I go back to this solution at the top, what you'll see is I have a very simple feature. Features are the way that you register extensions inside of SharePoint called the Maps and Blogs for Forms component. And when I look at the elements XML for this, you'll see that I've got a couple things here. Now, the way this works is it'll actually use some JavaScript that's on every page in the site to say, replace all A tags that have a certain CSS class with a Silverlight map control. And so to make this work, I'm taking advantage of a custom action where if the location is equal to script link, we'll actually register that JavaScript. So this makes it easy to get a ubiquitous JavaScript file that's registered inside of your SharePoint site. And then what I do is I actually register my ribbon button. So when I want to register a ribbon button, there's a bunch of XML that specifies where do you want to put this. And in my case, I want to put this in the insert tab on the ribbon. And what I want to create is a custom button called insert map. And there's a number of different attributes here for specifying which icon to use and how to lay it out in the ribbon that we'll be documenting and working through in the SDK. It should be available in the Beta 2 SDK. And then beneath this, you'll see that I define which action should be fired when that ribbon button gets clicked. And what it'll do is it'll fire a simple bit of JavaScript that's in my application. And then this provisions some resources. So when I go back to my map objects, what you'll see is I'm just using some JavaScript object models. So on load, what I'll do is I'll run a script called expand media objects, which will basically go through the page and find all the A tags that have a certain CSS class. Probably would have been cooler here to use jQuery, but I do it the simple way and, well, the maybe not so simple way to go loop through all those A tags and get the map elements. And then when I do that, I essentially replace it with a Silverlight tag. Now, to support the insert experience, I can use JavaScript to actually hook our modal dialog platform fairly easily. So I just say, go host this page getMapLink.aspx in a modal dialog. I specify some additional properties and a callback. And then finally, in my callback, what happens is that it'll use some JavaScript object model to get the rich text editor, to get the cursor of that, and then go insert this custom A tag with a custom map link. So you can do some pretty deep integrations with SharePoint. You can hook the ribbon. You can really override the ribbon, customize it exactly how you want to, and you can use JavaScript and some JavaScript APIs to really extend it. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of food for thought for how to extend the user interface of SharePoint. OK. OK, so final thing. Oh, before I get to that, Paul Stubbs will have a session on Thursday at 8:30 in the morning on doing lots of cool things with Silverlight. So I think if there's one sleeper hit for developers in SharePoint, besides the tools, it's Silverlight plus SharePoint will be huge, I think, for building applications. And Paul will go into that on Thursday. OK, so final topic is flexible deployment. And so you've created a great collaboration application, but IT won't let you deploy it because, boy, do I really want to risk these thousands of sites because you want a cool web part on your homepage? They might say no. So we've tried to create this détente between developers and IT, this middle ground where you give up a little bit of your freedom to do anything you want. There's a subset of things that you can code against. And IT feels comfortable because your code will run in a controlled sandbox that can only impact your site collection. And so with this sandbox technology, what we support is a subset of the solution model. So things like modules and lists and content types. We support web parts and event receivers and feature callouts and workflow actions and InfoPath business logic. We don't support all of the web part functionality. So you can't build, for example, connectable web parts inside the sandbox. And the API is also limited to things that you can only work against your site collection. So a site object, web object, list item object, et cetera. You can use things like administration.webapplication.backup are not available to you, unfortunately. And we've also unified the packaging format. So you can actually take WSPs and use them as your foundation for getting these solutions up into your SharePoint site. And this can include features and site definitions, et cetera. So let me just very quickly show you that. So I've already got this pre-built WSP package that maybe a developer gave to me. And so one of the things I might want to do is actually go and have a site for doing research on new products that we might want to integrate into our solution catalog. So in my site, there's this thing called the solution gallery, where I, as a site collection administrator, can go and just upload a solution almost as easily as you'd upload a Word document. I'll select my WSP package. Again, uses the same standard WSP with XML that you might be familiar with. And then when I'm done, I can just click the Activate button to turn this solution on inside of my site collection. So now this solution is available for me, and it's ready to go. Let me try to do that one more time. OK, so now the solution is turned on. So now when I go to the new site option, you'll see that there's a new entry here called product planning site. This is a new site definition I deployed along with my solution. So I'll say maybe we're researching a new tofu product. And so what this will do is it'll create a custom workspace for me. Oh, yeah, we have this bug in beta 2 where, I did this before. We have this bug in beta 2 where by default it'll choose basic meeting workspace, and it should really not force you down a particular path. So I'll try Tofurky. All right. So we want to research Tofurky. And so what this will do is it'll create a custom site using that definition that was in my solution. And you can see that, OK, maybe it's not the coolest site in the world, but it's got a custom master page. It's got a custom logo. It uses a Silverlight web part to show project status when the project status happens. The other interesting thing is that it's got an ASP.NET web part here for managing project status. And so what happens is if I say, OK, this project has been approved. We really want to ship Tofurky as a product. And I click Update. What will happen is code on the server fires, and it'll build out a project schedule based on the fact that I've approved this project. And so this is some custom code that runs on the server. Now, the cool thing about this is this all runs in the sandbox. And so IT can feel comfortable with letting developers use it. And developers get cool stuff like the ability to build ASP.NET web parts. So let me just show you very briefly what goes on behind the scenes to make this all work. So when you're running an application in the sandbox, it's been uploaded to the site collection. When it comes time to actually run that web part that was part of that solution, what will happen is we actually redirect that request from the front-end web server to a back-end service that basically manages a pool of processes for running custom code. And so your code doesn't run in w3wp.exe. It will run in spuc worker process.exe, meaning that if your code has an infinite loop in it and that takes down the server, you're only taking down the process that you've been routed to, and the rest of the impact of SharePoint, W3WP is not impacted by your problem, if you will. So we've got this whole monitoring process that monitors how the code runs. It's also CAS locked down, so there's a set of actions that you can't do. It's also limited in terms of the permissions that you're allowed to take advantage of. So it's a subset of code that runs in the sandbox, but it runs, in a sense, in a bomb-proof container so that IT can feel comfortable deploying it. So again, détente, the best of trying to make everyone happy, both IT and developers. OK, and if you want more information, there's a session later today at 4:30 that covers the details of the sandbox, the limitations, and how to actually use that sandbox in the context of SharePoint Online and how you would code in the cloud, if you will. OK, so that really covers the platform extensions that have been made to SharePoint. We talked about a lot of the different APIs you can take advantage of. We talked about the UI framework. And we talked about lists and external lists and how to get them into SharePoint. So taking these three pieces together, new tools, more platform services that you can take advantage of, and ways to get your solutions into places that you probably couldn't get them before. We hope that SharePoint will be a pretty cool choice. It'll have a lot of things to bring to developers to make them a lot more productive building applications. So with that, I'll open it up to questions. Thank you a lot for your time. I know I went through super quick, but hopefully you've gotten like a bite-sized taste of a lot of features, and you'll go to some of the sessions to get more of the deep dive. So with that, questions? If you wouldn't mind going up to the microphone, that'd be if the microphones are hooked up.
Yeah, if we've got existing ASPX controls or ASPCX controls, is there going to be a way to get those into this without having to rewrite them? Because right now, all the solutions out there don't really take full advantage of the controls.
So are you referring specifically to the sandbox or just SharePoint in general?
Just SharePoint in general.
So SharePoint in general, if you've got standard ASP.NET controls, there's a couple of additional steps that you need to take to make sure that they work inside of SharePoint. You need to register them as a safe control. And that's actually something that the Visual Studio tools will automate for you. You can very easily add safe control namespaces, and you don't need to customize web.config. So that's kind of the major hitch that you frequently need to do to get things into SharePoint. Now, the one thing with sandboxing is that that's probably the place where I expect some difficulty integrating controls because of certain things that are locked down inside of the sandbox. For example, calling to web services is something that's a bit more that is restricted in the sandbox, and so some controls that use that might not work as easily. So for full trust SharePoint deployments, it's just adding safe controls. For the sandbox, it's a little bit more difficult and nuanced. Question?
For the sandboxing, is there any way to control processor resources, memory resources, stuff like that for the sandbox?
Yeah, so under the covers, I didn't really show it too much, but under the covers, what happens is inside the sandbox, we control like CPU and a lot of different resources like we control all those things. Not only do we actually sort of have hard limits for if you use 30 seconds of CPU, your process will get terminated. But on top of that, we actually also aggregate the set of resources that are used per site collection. And so you see this bar at the top. What happens is we aggregate all those resources, and if a site goes over its CPU quota or SQL Server time quota, we'll actually stop custom code for that site collection. So yes, we do manage all of those attributes, and you can customize them. Unfortunately, a lot of those attributes are a little bit lower level, so you'll need to use code to customize them. Yep. Question over there?
Yeah, two questions actually. As far as I know, 2007 did not support any document library list without having actually document uploaded. Let's say you have a document library with columns. You could not upload a record without actually a document associated with it. Is that something fixed, or is there any other workaround for that?
Well, so for SharePoint, we basically have lists that are based on document libraries. So essentially, those always require that there's a file associated with them. And then we have just straight lists that don't require an item. Now, when you first create your list, you have to choose: do you want a library or do you want a list?
Right.
And you can't really mix the two together, unfortunately. And that limitation hasn't changed. But we do have essentially fileless lists, which are lists. for doing data structures like the products list that I showed.
But with the regular list, you don't get the check-in, check-out, and other document
Yeah.
library
So
features,
with,
right?
with a regular list, you have attachments, but which allows you to upload files associated with them, but you don't get any of the document management like check-in, check-out for those, unfortunately. So you do have to still kind of make that choice, unfortunately.
Okay. One quick question. Does 2010 support versioning of the metadata?
Does 2010 support versioning of the metadata? You mean with respect to content types and that sort of thing?
Right.
That itself isn't versioned any more significantly than in 2007. We do have some new features in Microsoft SharePoint Server that allow you to federate the deployment of those content types, but versioning is not a facet of that, unfortunately.
Okay. Thanks.
Question?
Two questions about security. First of all, for the external data sources,
Yeah.
if you're using SQL Server and you have a trusted connections, is it actually using the identity of the SharePoint service, or is it using the identity of the client? And is there a way that you can pass that down to the server? And then the second question was, again, about the REST, accessing a SharePoint site through the REST calls. What kind of permissions do you have to have on the site to do that?
Okay, so for the first question for the business connectivity, under the covers, what it'll, by default, what it'll use is the service account application pool. Now, inside of Microsoft SharePoint Server, not in SharePoint Foundation, you have this secure credential service. The initials for it are SSS, but I forget what the middle S is, that allow you to essentially have a store of credentials and then have them associated with users so that when user A comes in, it gets associated with credential B, and then credential B is what it goes to go retrieve that data for. So that you have some flexibility there, but when it comes to actually setting up these external connections, figuring out your authentication story turns out to be probably the trickiest aspect of it. There are some tools like that credential store, but by default, it'll sort of, maybe not great, it'll use the service account. To your second question about the REST-based data services, the security for that, under the covers, it's all using SharePoint security. So if you're going against a list, if I only can see 10 of those items, if I can only see 10 of those items, out of 20, then that REST feed for me will only show 10 items. So it's automatically security trimmed. Let me take just 2 more questions real quick, and then I'll take questions offline. Question?
How well does Visual Studio 2010 work with SharePoint 2007?
So unfortunately, one of the things that they weren't able to get to in Visual Studio 2010 was sort of retrofitting all of the support for like visual web parts back to SharePoint 2007. So Visual Studio 2010 does still continue to support the SharePoint 2007 workflow projects, but outside of that, unfortunately, it doesn't really support SharePoint 2007, sorry to say. And then one more question?
Does SQL reporting services, can it query the SharePoint lists and do reports?
Unfortunately, the answer to that one is no at the current time. Now, one of the things I didn't talk about, probably should have talked about, is that we actually have this other way through Access to create quick applications, have them hosted on SharePoint using lists under the covers. And this is really maybe not super straightforward, but for those types of access-driven lists, they've got built-in integration with SQL reporting services to drive those. But unfortunately, for generic lists, at the moment, I'm not aware of a connector for SQL reporting services direct to SharePoint lists. It's something that's high on our list to work towards. We've had conversations on those things, but it's not an immediate feature, unfortunately. OK, so if you have any other questions, I'll take them up on the front of the stage. I need to get off for the next folks. Thank you so much.